So I was looking through these guidelines over the weekend, and the problem always with guidelines is if you make them too long and too specific, then they become unreadable. They are guidelines. They're not a set of laws. You don't have to dot every I and cross every T. But at the same time, I was struck by my personal view that they glossed over, even with my understanding at the weekend, they glossed over some of the issues. You need to take care if you're using the internet. Well, that's got to be one of the understatements of the year, I guess. But I think there are several things which have come to light during the day, and we've had triangulation implies sort of 3 points, and we've had 4. Jill saying that, I paraphrase, that having research checked out, tick in the box from the ethics committee, is not actually enough, because even during the life of a project, things are going to change. And I don't think the personal responsibility of researchers to make sure they keep on top of the changing ethical climate comes out enough in these guidelines. You may think it does. The things that you can do that Ralph was talking about, to make not just the data is anonymized, but to make it very difficult to reconstruct. You were talking about, Ralph, having different data sets, fragmenting it so that it was actually terribly difficult. And Luciano, you touched on that as well. You could only take out one book from the library at a time. And one of the things which really struck me from the discussion we've had this afternoon, that the ethical guidelines, and it's not just BJET ethical guidelines, it's ARAs as well, talk about the individual. And just like the legislation that's coming out of Brussels, don't talk about the group, the rights of groups. It would be, pardon me, it would be a bit presumptuous, I think, to say we should start with a clean sheet of paper and rewrite the ethical guidelines. And anyway, we'll get it done this afternoon. It might be that various paragraphs need some adjustments and tinkering, a bit of extra wording. It might be that what there needs to be, not necessarily written now, but written later, is a sort of another page, sort of codicil. Can guidelines have codicils? What's the equivalent of some extra guidance notes for the guidelines, which would have the advantage that they could then be kept up to date. You could have this sort of this appendix, perhaps, to the guidelines. So there's what should be in it, how should it be presented, and the extent to which, as a willful group, we should present that to Vera, saying, we think you should give this consideration, and possibly we could encourage you to incorporate it in the. What are other people's views on this? I mean, that's a very personal view from listening today.
I mean, I agree with you that I think they need to be adapted. I don't think it's a case of starting again. I do think that we as a group, if people are so minded today, could indicate to Vera from this day that there was a fairly strong feeling that there needs to be some updating of the guidelines. I would agree that it needs to be limited updating. I think probably an appendix is quite helpful. I think it should be a working group and quite open and free in the sense that anybody could be invited to be part of it. Well, that would be fine. And I would suggest that actually, in addition to writing an appendix which is about those issues that we've identified today around new data, digital issues and so on, I think also there should be a going through of the whole thing with some suggestions for some amendments here and there. Amongst which I would suggest actually, I don't think the responsibility to do no harm, in other words, the primum non nocere in terms of first do no harm, as a basic principle of medical ethics originally and now education research as well, I think, is drawn out enough, actually. Especially not in view of the kind of issues that we've been talking about and the unpredictability of the way in which data can be re-identified now without one's being able to necessarily predict that in the future. In other words, it's moving so fast, the combinatory power of data sets. So, I mean, I would, broadly speaking, agree with everything you said, actually, and add a bit.
Could you just confirm to everybody that I haven't paid you to say that?
Yeah, I'm totally broke and he didn't pay anything and he never does.
Other views?
No, I mean, we're currently working at the area of transforming the current legislation that we have in the area of sharing actively and looking at what we have in terms of policies and then translating this into, well, the updated version. So one of the things, I mean, if you go through the list, for example, point 23 is, I'm just going to read it out loud, research must make known to the participant any predictable detriment arising from the process of research and finding in terms of learning analytics. It's so unknown, and we all know how complex learning is. We don't really know if we are going to personalize learning. I'm just bringing some for men and for women in slightly different ways because we know that men and women slightly learn in a different way. We don't really know what the effects might be. It might be that for some women it might work really well, for others not. So the difficulty is, in particular, also with the second part is there's so many unknown facts which in a constrained lab environment, or if you focus on typical educational research, you probably would know, okay, if you put people for 1 hour together, they're not going to kill each other. But in a learning analytics environment where you collect so much data, you don't really know where the boundaries are of an factor. And that's the thing which I think we'd be happy to work along to see, okay, does it need, whether it's an appendix or whether the framing can be slightly more liberal or slightly more prescriptive. That's something that you can debate on.
I think also these guidelines imply that we know who our participants are. And I think increasingly we don't know who our participants are. So I'm looking at MOOC data at the moment. Now if you've got a MOOC with 30,000 people,
you can't know them all.
You can't know them all. And even if they have disclosed things about themselves, you have no way of checking whether that is the case. And I think that's particularly the case when we're talking about things like children. Because children know that lots of places they're not supposed to go online up to the age of 13. So if they are under the age of 13, they lie. And you know that's taken as commonplace. I've got kids that age. You know, if you want to go there, you lie about your age. So you can't say, yes, everybody I've collected data about here is an adult. You might say that everybody I've collected data about claims to be an adult, but that's quite a different situation. So I think something needs to be built in about children, just acknowledging that, and about participants. So we don't know who the participants are, so we can't really say what the detriment or benefit to them might be. We can say what it might be to them as a whole, a large subsection of them, but we can't say what it's going to be to everybody.
we're also at the Open University and also doing work around ethics, not so much as a central point of what we're doing, but something we need to address in order to do the work that we're doing. So we are doing open research into open education. So we're committed to openness, basically, in every way that we possibly can be. And half the time we're trying to work out what does that actually mean to be doing that. So where we have data collection, for example, guaranteeing anonymity to people who take the surveys, can't quite do that. Because our intention is to release all the data as openly as possible. Take the names out, take the IP address out, but technically there's still a possibility that someone could be identified, as unlikely as that might be. We have open dissemination methods, basically all the kind of things when you put your approval form through, if you're a PhD student and you say, I want to do this experiment, all those guidelines that are in there, we kind of have to work out an alternative version of that, because we just can't control the variables. We don't know who's taking the surveys, we don't know who's out there, we don't know who is interested necessarily. We're also releasing all our instruments openly, as openly licensed, so our survey questions, interview questions, all that kind of stuff. So part of what we're working on at the moment is, okay, what's the ethics manual for this project? Especially when we're encouraging other people to potentially use these tools and to use our data sets, what is the ethical guidance that accompanies that about how to do that and how to license things properly and how not to misuse any of this stuff? So this is partly about moving towards these kind of open data scenarios, but there's also a whole kind of workflow through research and pedagogy which changes when you decide to do things in this open way. So there are all kinds of ethical challenges around there. The sort of position I often come back to is, well, actually, you're less able to indulge in this kind of rubber stamping, here's my proposal, well, that looks all right. I see you've taken some steps to guarantee anonymity of people and so on. Well, there you go. Precisely the thing that we were just warned about doing. At least if you're doing this kind of stuff, there are no guidelines out there. There isn't any real thread for you to follow. You just have to kind of try and take the principles that are informing the ethical guidance that's already there and think, what does that translate into when we're doing it in this open way? And I think, as Rebecca just said, there's more and more of this kind of open stuff, open learners, informal learners, people who are not necessarily affiliated to an institution at all. What's your obligation to them? They're not paying any money. What kind of duty of care do we have? We don't seem to have to care about them as customers in the traditional sense. So there's something else going on there. I think a lot of these relationships are not that well defined. In any kind of redraft of these kind of guidelines, I think something that moves in that direction and shows that there's more and more of that kind of stuff happening, there's more and more stuff happening openly and informally, and trying to clarify exactly what are the obligations that you have to people in these open scenarios when the bedrock of the ethical relationships that you had before was the institutional one. So someone joins the academy, these are their things, these are their rights, these are their responsibilities. But if someone doesn't even do that, well, in what sense do you have a special kind of obligation to them that you don't have to just any old person on the street? So those are some of the kind of things that we're dealing with and trying to work out a way of sometimes squaring a circle, honestly. But I'd be interested in anyone who's encountered these kind of issues at all.
Can you just explain a bit, when you said the ethics manual for a project? Yeah. That sort of conjured up in my mind the sort of picture of okay, well, I've got this company, it's got an office, and there is a risk assessment manual which hasn't been handed down by somebody. It's something which is generated by that office. It takes into account the local conditions of that office and the particular risks which might be there or might not, and doesn't talk about the ones which aren't there. But it becomes something which is then owned by the people in the office. Now, is that the sort of thing that you have in mind with the,
Well, this is
the manual for the project?
Well, kind of. It's complicated slightly by the fact that it's released on a CC BY open license. Basically, so if someone wants to take bits of it and change it and make it into their own, they can.
Right.
So the guidance in there is largely restricted to the purely formal. So these are the kind of things you want to think about. These are the kind of things.
Yeah.
But we can't say with much specificity because we don't know who's using it. This is exactly the kind of thing that you should be thinking about.
Yeah, but each project would have its own instance of.
I haven't known every project to have one of these manuals, but we've got one that's deliverable on our project. And
Yeah.
I think partly to reflect the fact that what we're doing is trying to sort of forge a path for others to follow. So if other people want to replicate our research and they're not doing it within an institution, here's a manual that will help them to understand whether what they're doing is ethically sound or not.
Because that would seem to fit, to me at any rate, with Jill's point about, we need to go beyond the tick in the box from the ethics
Precisely,
committee to something which is owned and is ongoing, can be amended by, and so on, the project itself.
And I think there's an element to that which encourages people not to get stuck into a kind of routine of getting your box ticked and getting your research proposal rubber stamped. If you can't rely on these existing principles and guidelines and you have to kind of think of your own, it means you've got to be prepared to defend them and justify them and engage rationally with what you're doing. Arguably in a way that you don't have to if your research is fairly sort of standard. Here you go, here's your approval, and as you said, now that goes into a file, and no one's going to look at it ever again.
That's
Do you
why I
have,
also
do you have a
think
requirement to review on a regular basis?
Review
To
what we're
review
doing.
that manual?
Well, yes and no. I mean, we wrote a draft at the start of the project to guide us in terms of what we're planning to do. That was about a year ago. So the next stage is to redraft it with actual examples of things that we've encountered, to say this is what came up, this is how we dealt with it. So it's a kind of live document, really. But the idea is that by the end of the project, it will be that combination of planning, reflecting, looking back, and extracting some sort of principles for other people to follow.
Is that something that could be shared?
Yeah,
And if you send me a copy,
it's online now.
I can, or it's online somewhere.
Yeah, I can send you a link or something.
If you send me a link, I can circulate that link round the group.
Sure.
I mean, I think what's helpful to go with that also is the notion of local leadership and governance, in terms of it's not just being the ethics committee's job only, it's the researchers as well, and all of us really. And actually, the points that you were making about reflective processes, ongoing reflective processes of self-criticism really, in terms of project awareness. And I suppose as part of that, the kind of learning community aspects of it, which is the inclusion of a variety of viewpoints democratically, so that people do feel enabled to actually challenge and critique what ethics means in the context of this. And I think that sort of approach then means that it's actually, hopefully, part of the research which is really beneficial. I some years ago made all our doctoral students actually do an ethics form at the point in time that they were doing their research proposal. Well, invited them to. So that actually went hand in hand with the proposal. And eventually, having hasted it first, people began to see that was actually a really helpful way of taking ownership of the ethical issues rather than just leaving it to some policing body, And I think it's very important that the process elements you're talking about, continuous process.
So when I was talking to my colleagues in this EU project about informal learning, which were dealing with the NHS regulations, they also reported that it helped them a lot to go through all these ethical regulations to make them think about their research process. So because they had to do a lot of more in advanced planning than they were used to do. And that helped to improve the quality of research as well. So it could be also a positive effect of ethical guidelines and regulations there that it make the research process better quality. Yeah? So.
I think picking up on a point of Rob's to some extent, the BJET guidelines assume that what we're doing is social science research. So point 25, the confidential and anonymous treatment of participants' data is considered the norm for the conduct of research. Now, it's the norm for the conduct of social science research, it's not the norm for arts research, for example. So if I was doing oral history, I wouldn't expect to keep my sources confidential. If I was writing about literature, I would be expected to cite where the quotes came from. I wouldn't be expected to say an anonymous writer from the 17th century. I'd be expected to say who it was. And I think the internet, to some extent, takes us into the realms of arts research, because in some cases there is an ethical obligation to cite what people have created. So when we're doing MOOC research, every single comment which takes place on the Future Learn MOOC platform is CC by attribution. So if I put in any of those as a data point in any publication, I have to go and find out who said it, which is actually quite confusing because I get anonymised data sets. So I get an anonymised data set with all the comments in, and then I have to backtrack and find out who actually said it, which is quite, they said it on page 16, let's go and look at page 16 to see who said it. And I think that's the case with quite a lot. I mean, we're just talking about analytics here, but I've done work in virtual worlds as well, which is other educational technology research. And then there was a whole thing about avatars, and do you name avatars or do you give them do you anonymise them or give them pseudonyms? Because part of the creation of the individual is how they've named their avatar and the qualities they've given to that avatar. So by not attributing that, to some extent you're working on that ethically, especially if they're an artist.
Yeah.
Because we were working with machinima makers and artists, and to anonymise them was giving them completely the wrong set of ethical guidelines, because it wasn't attributing all the wonderful things they were doing.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was smiling because I was relating the idea of an avatar to what Luciano was saying about the bits of data which are by him, and the bits of data which actually don't matter at all. Your name is a matter of public record. Your date of birth is a matter of public record. Is your avatar a matter of public record, or is that something?
If you've spent 10 years creating an avatar who runs your entire business and makes your entire income, that is a very serious business.
Yeah.
Just to follow on from that, I was doing some analyses a month or so ago on students' perceptions of group work. And one of the sort of research tools I used was just to sort of analyse all Twitter comments about group work that anyone could have made and then kind of sifted them through. So then what do you do? People have maybe putting that data into the public domain and saying that, but then you're analysing their comments. And this is a complete stranger, that you've just picked up from searching hashtags and things. What's the obligation there, in terms of that data?
Perhaps I can report a case I had also in the paper I reviewed. Yeah, so they did a study about a student cohort and peer reviewing of exercise solutions. Yeah. So so the task was to review papers by other students and then to review their own paper. Yeah. But what the students did not know, so that everything was copied before it was given to the reviewers, and it was not intended to study the quality of peer review, but the cheating behavior of students. If they really try to correct solutions afterwards. Yeah? So I think this is really something I had the feeling at that time it was really unethical. Yeah? So so because there are no monkeys, yeah? So there are human beings. Yeah? So and even if it's interesting to get knowledge about that, yeah? So would not let slip of papers through without the comment that this is a really unethical piece of work. Yeah?
There's so much research on academic integrity, which it by necessity involves some deception. But otherwise, how would we understand?
I mean, I'd just like to make 2 points about that, and I think that the point that immediately strikes me is the issue of training. And I think your thing about informal learning is very helpful, because I think the research ethics communities, which are part of the committees and people who talk about research, are actually the learning communities in which this kind of development of understanding begins, hopefully, to take place. But I also think that maybe the guidelines should talk about, training more, in fact, because of the issues that are upon us now. The next point I wanted to pick up was also the humanities issue, and to say that actually I think these need to be more multidisciplinary altogether, because, for example, to take another multidisciplinary issue, in terms of detriment, let's say we were doing neuroscience research and we were doing electrics on the brain or whatever, there's a risk because it's electricity. It doesn't do to consider detriment in terms of actual physical risk. I don't think it's robust enough. And so, but there may be multiple instances, because there's many people now who are doing education research with other things. Where the whole field is developing and changing. So I think that should be part of the guidelines, multidisciplinary.
What process do we think would do it? We have a set of guidelines. There's somewhere else we want to be. And one possibility, I guess, would be to set up a working party of the willing and able, which could be a subset of this group, those who are prepared to give a little bit of time to do it. Another would be to solicit comments and bits of rewritten text, which somebody then puts together. And if Jill had a bit of time, I guess she and I could do that. So you volunteering here?
That would be nice, thank you so much.
That's quite all right. What do we think would be best? What's the best?
Unless people want to be part of a group, I would suggest that there is a kind of collaborative email exchange, and then maybe a meeting to which lots of people are invited with the draft to discuss it and then do feedback. So it's like not a long process, because I think everybody's just so busy nowadays. By long, I mean in terms of meetings. Perhaps a Google Doc.
Yeah.
A Google Doc, yeah. And then one sort of, I don't know what you think about, one seminar event or meeting or something centrally where everybody can get to. And then there's a discussion with lunch or something just to talk about it. Do you think that might work?
How many people are coming to the Bureau conference this September? The majority? One? Well, we've got two. Not Ralph. He's going to be somewhere else. You'll still be recovering from Tallinn.
Another conference. The actual conference is also.
Okay. I mean, one possibility would be, if we were going to get together, to try and get together at the Bureau conference. If
Good idea.
Half the people in this group are going to be there, it simplifies things. Just get a room for an hour or so, and that would also give us a timescale.
And also, people who weren't going to the conference, if you made it just before, they could go to the meeting anyway. They wouldn't have to go to the conference. And it's not tied to the conference, is it?
Does that seem reasonable? A reasonable process? Can I just check with everybody, or at least the people who are still here, because Bureau are going to ask me whether I've done so. Are you happy for your contact details to be used in such a way? The Bureau Office is very sensitive about how we use contact details for things which are not the original purpose. So, any dissent? No dissent, right. Carried unanimously. Right, so look, let's do this. I'll circulate everybody with just a sort of summary of what it is that we think we're going to do. We use Google Docs to build a working version. Anybody in the group can contribute to it. We think in terms of a meeting in September, to which people could either contribute written evidence or attend in person. And then we present Vera with some suggestions. We can't impose it on them, but some suggestions as to how the guidelines might be rewritten, might be enhanced, revised, whatever we're going to call it, for the next edition. Yeah.
Can I make one suggestion?
Please.
I mean, we're currently revising the ethics procedures in the OU, and we're all semi-experts in this field because we're going through ethics always. But I
Careful,
think,
never volunteer.
no. But one of the things which I think work really well is if we use a lawyer, a legal expert from the OU. So it might be good. I don't know
Great
whether
idea.
Vera has this.
Look, I mean, no, Vera doesn't. You know, anything that we can research from the work that the OU are doing, great. So,
because I mean, in terms of this issue, like in terms of guidelines, we already have like loads of criticism from a legal expert, and we can't call things guidelines if we like that. So
Yeah.
I mean, in a way,
I think all comments, advice, input is more than welcome, and will be duly attributed. Right. Look, I suggest that that's probably a good point at which to conclude. Long ago, I came to the conclusion that the best conferences to go to were events like this were the ones which were like, a bit like a tinderbox. You remember the tinderbox? That thing we used to have before we had cigarette lighters. Tinderbox contains a flint, a bit of steel, and some kindling. And you've got to have all three. And I developed this metaphor when I was in a job which meant that I had to go to lots and lots of conferences on EdTech. And it was lots of fun. I met all sorts of people that I'd met last month. And I had another drink with them, and I knew that in another couple of months I'd meet them again, and so on. So in terms of learning, virtually nothing happened, to me or to them. And I came to the conclusion that what you need out of events is a disparate mix. So you get some new ideas coming in. And I think we've had that today. We've had a view from somebody who is intimately involved with ethics committees, computing science, philosophy, publishing, and by listening to all four, we've different perspectives on this whole business of ethics in educational research. I can't remember a day when I've learned quite so much. No, not from just the four speakers, but also from the comments that have been made not from the floor, but from the tables around. So thank you very much indeed all for coming. To the three speakers who remain, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. It's been I've really enjoyed it. It's been a great day for me. I hope it's been a good day for you. Have a safe journey back. Before you go, or if you really can't do it before you go, can you post to me, or scan and send to me, or to Marie Blythe, or somebody, your feedback sheets. And apart from that, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.